Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this exciting session, Making Hybrid Work with Google and Jamf. We're glad you all made the trek over here. Did everybody enjoy the keynote? Yeah. Awesome. Very good. Well, we have an exciting panel here today, and I'm excited to dig into a little bit more of all the great stuff that we talked about during the keynote with Google. We have a couple of esteemed guests here. In no specific order, we have Dean. You all know Dean, and Amol Kabe, who is the Senior Director of Product Management at Google, and then Parisa Tabriz. Everybody knows Parisa from her keynote experience, but she is the VP of Chrome browser at Google. We are going to be talking about hybrid work and a lot of different things in areas where Jamf and Google intersect today. And I want to start out with the question of how all of you have seen work change over the past couple of years, kind of the big question these days. But I'm curious if you could kind of tell us a little bit more about that.
I can start. I think pre-COVID for me and a lot of my team, we were in the office all week, obviously. And now there's so much more flexibility for employees and organizations. I don't know if any of y'all remember like BBC Dad in like 2017? Like it was so quaint when like his kid was like walking in on him, and now that's like Monday, right? Like people are working from home and they're in the office, and I think hybrid work just presents this massive shift, opportunity, and set of challenges along with it, and companies have had to really rapidly transform. And Google was digital native for a long time. Chrome, my team, is very, very distributed. And so I think, we had an easier time than others, but there's no going back to what was. Kudos to folks in this room, because I know that, many of you had to actually enable that digital transformation during incredibly stressful times for companies, for individuals, for families. And so kudos, thank you. And I think that I'm excited to see how hybrid will continue to enable flexibility and innovation. Like I really do see products, technologists, kind of innovation coming from that change, and excited to see how that can continue to happen.
Awesome. Amol, I'm curious from your perspective at Google, what have you seen?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we saw right off the bat was IT leaders taking the forefront in that transformation journey that folks were on. The work could not have happened if IT did not step up and help with that transformation, right? We used to joke in the pre-COVID era and say, coffee shop IT, we want to enable some customers to be able to work from coffee shops. But really, we didn't imagine that the coffee shop would actually be your kitchen, right? And it only was possible because of the technology. It was at the right time for people to be able to adopt and work safer, even if they were working from home, right? And that's really been the theme that IT has enabled, companies have embraced, COVID has taught us, is you can work in a distributed environment, you can be productive in a distributed environment, but you do need the tools to be able to be productive, and you need the tools to be able to be safe, and you need the tools to be able to protect your intellectual property, protect your customers' data, and that's all brought everything to the forefront and accelerated that transformation.
Yeah. Dean, obviously a little bit different sized company, a little bit different dynamics, but how would you describe that transformation at Jamf?
First of all, I have to say, I heard people cheer in the next room, and I'm always jealous when I'm in one room and I hear people cheer in another. So at some point in time during this session, we got to make the room next to us jealous. And so just, you can choose your moment to just roar and have everybody wonder what's going on in here. But you asked specifically, what we were most excited for. And two things for me, one in the workplace, one in schools. In the workplace, and I mentioned this actually back in 2020 during the JNUC keynote, that back in 1995, when I was working on my graduate degree, I was writing my thesis paper, and the thesis paper was called Telecommuting in an Engineering Organization. And I was just sold on the concept, and my major conclusion was now that we had 14.4 analog baud modems, we could work from anywhere. and I was only, some 25 years and a pandemic away from being spot on. So every place that I went after I wrote that thesis paper, I just really was always passionate about telecommuting. And I won't get into all of the philosophical beliefs on it, but I was a believer. And every place that I went, I actually would try and get the management team on board with really embracing a significant telecommuting program. And I just never could. I was never influential enough to get it done. And then, so therefore, when we sent everybody home on March 12th, I remember it well, it was probably not a week later that I announced to everybody at Jamf. And oh, by the way, this is forever. Whatever ends up happening, we are going to have workplace choice for the rest of my time at Jamf. And it has allowed us to recruit from so many different locations. It is, there's been accessibility benefits that have come from it. There's just been a lot of, it creates challenges as well, but in my view, the challenges are worth it to get some of the benefits that are out of it. And of course, we miss each other, and those that want to go into the office can go into the office. But I think from a management perspective, what it's forced us to do is to manage people, lead people according to their output, according to what they create and do, not according to what we see. Used to always drive me crazy years and years ago when I'd walk around the office with some leader that I was with at 5 o'clock, and they'd be going, where is everybody? They're not working. And hey, that person would have no idea whether those individuals are working early in the morning or late at night. So let's focus on what gets done, not what we see. So that's the first thing that I'm excited about. The second thing in education is, a lot of schools and governments woke up to the fact that when we sent students home to learn, that, oh my goodness, those students don't have the same technology benefits as do some other students. And my response to that is, yeah, that's always been true. You notice it now because it's during your classroom time that they don't have those technology benefits. But for years, we've been sending them home, and under-resourced students have not got the same homework advantages as students with more resources. And so I think I've been calling it an awakening that has occurred within education, and I love it.
That's awesome. One thing I do want to call out is if you hear something during the session that makes you think of a question, you can submit your own questions, and we will take a few of those at the end of the session. So continue on that theme. I'm curious if there are things that you are thinking of that maybe companies will be overlooking or not thinking about when it comes to hybrid work. Maybe we can start with you, Parisa.
Yeah, I think Dean just talked a little bit on equity or inequity in the education place. And we care pretty deeply about inclusive collaboration and what is possible with hybrid or what actually becomes more challenging. And even pre-COVID, you're in a big meeting room, and there's some people who have an easier chance to get a voice in, a question in, and that could be because of power imbalance, their own comfort, cultural norms in terms of whether it's comfortable, you can interrupt people or not. And I think one of the things we've really been thinking about is how can tools kind of advance inclusion in the workplace, especially with collaboration. It's so important that you bring people together with diverse perspectives to actually solve a problem. And you for me, I want people that think very differently to be tackling problems to come together. But with that diversity, you just have like a range of norms. And how do you really pick solutions and enable things so that people, regardless of their location, their ability, their skin color, their device preferences, can actually come together to work effectively? It's not the type of thing that is necessarily top of mind, especially if you're in a position of power and making some of these decisions. Yeah. But it really should be, as we think about hybrid work, just so that we can ensure every underrepresented voice has a seat at those virtual tables or virtual water coolers that I think we're going to increasingly be finding as part of how we work.
Awesome. Amol, how about you?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with what has been said. One of the things that we think about, I'm responsible for Zero Trust at Google, is how do we make it easy for everyone to work with what they have access to, right? So whether it's just because we're Google doesn't mean that we don't think that our customers don't have a Mac or an iOS device or a Windows device, So we want to make sure that we're inclusive in terms of how we think about the environments that people work in and they operate in, and how do we make it easy for them to bring that and be productive at work, right? And you'll see the difference between Parisa and I, because I'm from an enterprise background, and Parisa has a more enterprise plus consumer kind of viewpoint, right? But that's actually what leads to a healthy way of thinking about things. Okay, this works for a consumer at home. This works for a school. This works for an enterprise. And they're not exclusionary. We're trying to find ways that it works for all three use cases or more, right? And also for folks who are in different geos, folks who are differently abled, and you want to be able to thinking about them actively. And I think the pandemic has really forced some of those discussions to the forefront and made it more visible, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times we just took it for granted, and now because of the fact that we're peeking in, so to speak, in people's homes and kitchens and where they're coming from, and the kids coming in, like the BBC dad, you're bringing your whole self to work, and that's actually better.
Yeah, I think there's never been more intersection of consumerization and enterprise needs than today, right? Parisa, can you tell me a little bit more about this idea of like inclusive collaboration? You dipped into this a second ago. I want to go back there.
Yeah, and I think, by the way, like strong believer also in consumerization of enterprise, and just like, as you said, like, we're people at the end of the day, using computers to get stuff done with more flexibility. Now we can be doing different things in different places. It's not this hard separation. I mentioned virtual table, virtual watercolor, and it's some of the small things I've seen in some of video conferencing software. We use Google Meet, hand raise feature, like that didn't exist pre-pandemic. It seems kind of like obvious, in hindsight, but something as small as that, and sort of setting norms around, hey, who's going to facilitate, and looking at a queue of hands raised really actually makes it just easier for people to feel comfortable chiming in and having those norms established. We invest a ton in making sure Chrome works well with screen readers. We've used machine learning to automatically be able to describe images that lack alt text, because not everyone who's building web pages necessarily adds that, and so how can we describe pages better for those screen readers? We know that Chrome is so much reading actually happens. So it's a huge reading surface, and that really needs to work well for people with visual impairments. We have some work to try to give tools for those with dyslexia or other cognitive impairments, just to make it easier to do that work. And then one thing that I've been playing with, I believe it's a Chrome extension right now that we use internally, but we have emoji interactions. And one, it's just kind of fun, like when you're in a video conference, to like have an exploding popper or thumbs up, thumbs down emoji, but then you can even just pick your own skin color. I've actually never met anyone in real life that is emoji yellow, but recognizing that there's a range of skin colors so that you can show up in that space without conforming to emoji yellow is small, but I think just even acknowledges, people come in all colors in the room. So those are like some small features that I think actually together really do add up and help people bring their best self forward.
This is our chance. Let's hear it for accessibility features in software.
Well done.
Amol, curious for your perspective.
I actually love the crab emoji when a meeting's going sideways, crab
I thought you
goes
said
across.
crap, and I'm like, actually, we do need emoji poop. But yeah, crab, yes.
I think we have those too. But one of the things that I like to think about is, we think a lot about what I would say are the folks who are present and in the meeting, right, who are in positions of power. But if you think about in a modern corporation, what you need to get work done, you actually have a lot of extended workforce. So how do we make it easy for everyone to get access to the information they need to get their work done?
They're competing.
Oh, we have started a competition.
Every
Great.
day.
I gotta think of something funny. I didn't fall off the stage or something, just to get people going. And so if you think about a knowledge worker who's producing content, usually you provide them with the best interface, with the best, highest powered laptop, with the best screen, etc. But you also want to think about, hey, what if we have someone who needs access to just one application, right? They just need to come in, get that work done. They're a contact center worker. They're helping with data entry. Those are all the people who make a corporation tick, and we need to think about how to make them productive and how to make them enjoy their work and be able to be productive while staying safe and while keeping the corporation's data safe at the same time. So that the different segments of folks who show up to work and how to make them inclusive is something that we tend to think about as well, right? As we're building, make it easy to work, not just think about safety as the number one priority. It's that in the keynote, it was highlighted multiple times. It's not just about safety, it's about productivity and safety.
Yeah.
And that productivity is different for different folks.
Yeah, love that. Dean, what does inclusive collaboration mean to you?
Yeah, first of all, I want to plus one on the fact that emojis are becoming the common language of the world.
Hieroglyphics
It
to
doesn't matter what
emojis, yeah.
language you speak, we're good
Yeah.
if we all speak emoji. And I'm kind of serious about that. You get to see reactions around the world when you lead a workforce around the world and how they feel about things. I'll be honest with you, when it comes to collaboration, inclusiveness, and equity, I am way more concerned about the move from remote to hybrid than I was about on-premise to remote. We just had to go, and we went, and immediately the tech met us there, and provided that you had equitable access, back to my earlier point about just simply having access, but if we assume we have equitable access to tech for a moment, as most of us in the workforce do, we could figure it out entirely remote. And prior, when we were on premise, whenever you had that meeting of 15 people and 2 were online, or lo and behold, 1 was online, it would always be like, oh yeah, Josh, how do you feel about that? Forgot you were there. And it's so hard to be a part of the discussion. Being a remote employee in general is very difficult because organizations tend to think about their headquarters as being, the center of the world. And when we all went remote, all of a sudden everybody was just sort of, doesn't matter where you're from. In fact, we didn't even know where anybody was from. So coming back into a hybrid world where you do have a conference room full of people, I don't want to return to that haves and have-nots. For me personally, what I have found, and it's really interesting, because back when I wrote my thesis paper on telecommuting and the way I always lived my life pre-COVID was, I've got a lot of meetings today, I need to go into the office. And on days where I didn't have a lot of meetings, maybe I'll stay home because I can get more done on those days. As it turns out, it's the exact opposite. That on the days that I have a lot of meetings, the most productive thing I can do is sit in front of, we bought a company 2 days ago. I haven't met anybody from the company yet. We met via Google Meet. We got it all done. It was all good. So, on those days that you have a lot of meetings, it's super efficient just to do it there. It's actually the days that I don't have a lot of meetings where I have the capacity to go around and talk to people, get people in a room, whiteboard a little bit, visit. Those are the days that I want to go to work because I actually have the time to socialize a bit and connect with the people that I work with.
What a nice choice to have, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So that's a good segue maybe into how now with these flexible environments we need to be thinking about security. You all have really strong backgrounds in security in very different ways, but I'm curious, Amol, if you can tell us a little bit more how organizations can be thinking about these security challenges and really implement real solutions for this new hybrid environment.
Sure. I've been at Google 2 years. I joined during the pandemic. One of the reasons I joined was I saw the adoption of Zero Trust, right? At Google, I'd read all the papers, Beyond Corp came out, and the reason why Google adopted Zero Trust very early was because they got hacked, right? We got hacked. And it was a state actor. It was one of the first high-profile state actor attacks. And that caused Google to reimagine what security means. And I think the pandemic has caused everyone to reimagine what security means, right? And it's not security at the cost of productivity. Like, there's no safer way of working with a computer than if you shut it down, lock it in the safe, and look at it, right? But it's not going to get a company bought. It's not going to get children educated. So how do you go out and say, I'm going to enable my end users, I'm going to enable my employees, I'm going to enable my contractors, I'm going to enable my partners to be able to be productive and stay safe. You had a bank on stage. They have regulated data. There's severe consequences to loss of that regulated data. So you have to consider all of those use cases as you're going through and thinking about productivity and security and the balance between the two, right? And the way that I would think about it is the CISO's function, IT's function, has gone from being Dr. No, right, to saying, yes, I will enable you to get your work done. I'll enable you to work securely, and I will not have an impact to your productivity. And we're on that journey. So there's still more promise than reality in some cases, but all the exciting announcements you saw today, the theme that was there was really about saying security and productivity does not have to be a compromise, right?
Yeah, for sure. I never thought I would live in a moment where it was like security and experience could live in harmony.
Exactly.
It's very, very strange, but great. Parisa, from your standpoint, we talked about this sort of enterprise meets consumer expectation. How about you?
I think some of it's very similar. This context, I used to work, my first job was, lifeguard, but then my first real job was an IT admin in my college dorm. And people aren't coming to you to say like, I want more security. They're like, I want this to work, to do a thing. And so I have lived that trade-off for a long time. I focused a long time for security. And so for sure, at Google, started as a security engineer, helped build out some central security teams and Chrome security. And so cared deeply about that and know how important it is. It's only more important now. Now it's a mainstream discussion topic. And when I took on Chrome, beyond security, you just get an insight into performance and productivity and what people really need and that trade-off space. Chrome, we have these principles that have existed since we launched around security, simplicity, speed, and stability. And that really guides everything we do. And it's not one is more important than the other. It really is how do we advance them together. And over so many different projects, it's how can we make it more secure and more performant. So, I think that, as Amol said, like it's both. It's not an or, it's an and. This is actually where our teams work pretty closely together. I'd mentioned the integration of Beyond Corp into Chrome so that we have integrated threat and data protection. We know enterprises, employees are spending, in some cases, far majority of their time inside of a browser. And so that's where they're working. That's where there's really relevant signals for IT teams to keep their enterprises secure. And our teams work close together to make sure that's integrated and seamless and not getting in the way of people doing work. Because ultimately, one, if it's getting in the way, it's going to lead to a lot of complaints, tickets, unhappy employees, unproductive employees, and that's not good for business. Really, I think Jamf has been a great partner and proponent for this work on Zero Trust too. So I think +1 to everything.
And all the signal sharing, if you have Jamf installed, it comes in to the Beyond Corp Alliance, so we can attest that the device is actually secure. So those are the kinds of things that kind of build that ecosystem of security and productivity for end users.
We are big believers in zero trust. We are, many of us, myself included, are from Minnesota, and so there's a thing called Minnesota NICE. And so when you hear Jamf talk about trusted access, we're saying the same thing, just nicer. So just know that's the same thing when you hear it, that we're just saying you can trust every access. Why? Because we're implementing zero trust and embracing zero trust frameworks. One of the things that is discouraging about security is, first of all, let me just, if anybody's ever been in a board of directors for a company, so here's a sentence that's never been said by a board of directors. We think you're investing too much in security. Boards are constantly speaking to their management teams about you have got to beef up your security. So, but what happens is within an organization, hierarchically, so if a board is the highest level within the organization, they love security this much. And if you get down to the individual contributor, the love goes exactly like this, right? That when it gets down to the person, nobody likes security. You don't want to have to live inside of that framework. But in my view, I don't have a self-driving car, but I do have one of those cars that if you get out of the lane, it kind of bumps me back into the lane. And it's so irritating when I don't think about it. When I do think about it, I'm like, well, thank goodness I wasn't supposed to be drifting over into that lane anyway, or I was supposed to be putting on my blinker before I went into that lane. It's there to protect me. So when I look at, one of the reasons we spent as much time as we did on BYOD this morning is there's something that's more profound that happened as a result of Apple's user-based or account-based user enrollment. When Apple came out with that, prior to that, at Jamf, I haven't required that every single device that touches any of our organization resources is enrolled, because we wanted to be able to use BYO devices, and frankly, full MDM is a little bit too creepy on a BYO device, and so we didn't require it everywhere. Now that user enrollment exists, and it takes some convincing to individuals, but obviously I'm a believer. As a result of it existing, we are at the state for the first time in our history that we can go, no. If we're going to work, whether it's a personally owned device or whether it's a corporate device, that device should be enrolled. And from there, and the way that we talk about trusted access is that enrollment is the first step. I mean, think about it. You need to know, even in human dynamics. I'm not going to go to, some of the individuals that I may not know in the front row and just go, I trust you completely, even though I know nothing about you. However, if you share with me a little bit about yourself first, if I even get a chance to maybe look at a little bit of your personal inventory, that's the beginning of the trust relationship. Enrollment of a device is the beginning of a trusted relationship. And then you start to implement some of these other principles like the Beyond Corp, where you're actually checking with the trusted source, is this still a compliant device? And at each point of access. So now you've got, we've got a little information about the device, and you're the one that's nudging over, stay in the lane, and that's just perfect. That's exactly how it should be. It's only an irritant if you don't think about it. If you think about it, it actually is something that should happen to protect the organization and us individually. I've gotten to the point of really appreciating the security software that's on our devices. And I guess our goal would be, if I were to steal a moment from A Few Good Men, that we want all of the users of devices to have that approach of, you want us on that device, you need us on that device, because it actually protects you, us, in addition to the organization.
Yeah, funny story was, and I worked very closely with a team that implemented Beyond Corp a decade ago. And when they first started rolling it out, they would have people calling in saying, hey, I think we have a security incident because I can access this over the internet. It was so seamless
Yes.
that they didn't even realize that there was protection in place. And what it meant is everything within Google, there's no such thing. It's the reason why it's beyond corp is because there's a corp net, right? That was you were trusted if you're within the corp net. And what we got to was, hey, no matter where you were, we had all of these checks to make sure your device, the person, the authentication was all secure. And users love it because you can be in a coffee shop and be productive. Or
That's a great story. That's exactly how security should be. Absolutely.
Security is a daunting conversation. Parisa, I'm curious if you had to give some advice to organizations who are maybe considering this for the first time, especially with as deep as security solutions can go and as complex as you can get for hunting for threats and whatnot. What's the best place to start?
In truth, I'm still actually processing "You're a few good men." You want this on your device. You need this on your device, and so that wouldn't be my approach. But I think it's actually an approach and a cool approach, and that could have been the applause. I'm more go back, start with basics, and I think there's such a spectrum of where people are at. So when I'm giving advice, usually I kind of want to know where people are at, and there's some, enterprises that they have no visibility into kind of their browser fleet. So usually what I'll just say is start with basics, manage your browsers. And I think, as I'd mentioned, we've really seen this paradigm shift over the past decade to so much more work happening in the browser, on the web platform. And I think if you have that visibility into the web browser, which it's not just a window to the web, it really is kind of a central part of IT strategy, especially as it relates to security, that gets you a lot. And I think if you have confidence in controls there, have visibility into security insights, and just information about the browser, it's such a great foundation for really protecting users, threats they're facing in real time, and then also protecting your enterprise overall. So.
And let's face it, that movement to spending so much time in the browser, that has actually facilitated the growth of Apple within the enterprise, because when you had this world of everything was a Windows-based app, when you started to live more in the browser, that opened the door to a lot more proliferation of Apple devices.
Yeah.
Parisa, you sort of alluded to this journey, this security journey. Amol, can you help us to dig into that?
And we have a lot of folks we talk to and they say, okay, I want to go to zero trust overnight. How do I do it? And the answer is you don't, right? Another funny story that was told to me is everything at Google has now transitioned to using Beyond Corp, right? It was a journey of 2 or 3 years, except the HVAC system in one building, which still requires a VPN access because somebody went out of business or something, and they're not upgrading the HVAC system, right? It's very important to identify who you can have an impact to, and say, I can take this segment of my pilot group or my folks who work like this and transition them to a safer spot. So I'm going to pick on call center folks again. Do call center folks really need access to the HR system or the payroll system? So you can actually just say, look, let's take all of them, all the apps that they access, and move them to a zero trust environment. And that increases the safety of the organization and reduces the risk profile in a non-linear way, right? So if you start with mapping out your users, identifying the segments that could benefit the most, and they're probably also working from many different locations, especially if you think about what the pandemic did, it showed that you could work from home, you could work for 2 hours at a time, you could be productive during different non-standard times. And if you start with those segments, you identify and you say, here's the roadmap of how we're going to transition, and these user segments, these applications, these sets of users, then it becomes a manageable journey. And there's no easy answer, there's no overnight answer, but there is a journey to a safer, more productive place.
And it's interesting because along the way, it's all incremental improvement, right? So
it's all incremental improvement.
Always better than you were, even if you're not there right away. Dean, we've heard a lot about trusted access today. What haven't we heard yet? What else is up there?
Well, yeah, I mentioned a little bit earlier that I'll give my I'll use JNUC as an example of you all got access to JNUC. Well, what were the critical components to get access to JNUC? Well, first of all, you had to enroll, you had to sign up. So that goes back to the beginning of the trusted relationship is to enroll yourself in something, right? And then you had to show up, and you had to have an ID that would prove that you are you when you get here. So therefore, if you haven't embraced a cloud identity solution, I would strongly encourage you to do that, because you got to have that ID. And then this hasn't always been the case for every JNUC that we've ever done, but it happens to be on this one. In this particular one, we required vaccinations and a health pass. Well, that's saying that my analogy continues, you're a safe device coming in. So you really need to combine those three things that Jeremy was talking about. He said that it was combining of management, identity, and security. Essentially, that's what he's saying, is combine enrollment in something with being able to capture your identity and have that be a trusted identity, and constant monitoring of the device itself to make sure that there are no threats, with then the ability to, in an instant, block that access so that nobody else is harmed. And then the final step, I would say, kind of goes right back to the management again, because you want to then mitigate that potential compromise that is on that device. Well, how do you typically mitigate security issues? Well, of course, you might block things, but you might remove a piece of software. What is that done with? That's done with management. You might install or update a piece of software. What is that done with? That's done with management. So the way we feel about, as Michael put it this morning, management and security being two sides of the same coin, is we think the trusted relation starts with an enrollment, and we think ultimately then that management mitigates issues that you find with your security solutions.
I can see the trusted access philosophy book someday, where it's not just IT, it's not just security, it's life. Life is trusted access. All right, so we're gonna do a lightning round question here before we get to some audience questions. Name just for me one thing that each of you do to create a more inclusive environment while keeping security in mind. Lightning round. Parisa.
I'm so bad at lightning rounds. My team is spread around the world. I actually have a team meeting later today, and so we will do a presentation, that's EMEA friendly, Europe friendly, and then end up doing follow-ups with Asia Pacific, because we have a team there too, and we will try to rotate those around. And so some amount of recording, but also live engagement, and it's just a recognition that, as far as I know, there's no one time zone that literally everyone in the world can join in at the same time. So some of it's, that logistics and coordination.
We haven't figured out how to stretch time yet, have we? How about you, Amol?
I think that is actually the challenge of our times, right? Is if people are, not just time zones, if people are working non-standard hours, because they're now holistically thinking about their work life as one, and I need to go take my kids to a doctor's appointment, or I need to go to a doctor's appointment, or whatever it is. We're trying to make sure that if there's a meeting and folks can't make it, it's recorded. We're trying to rotate the meeting time zones so more people can participate. And we're trying to make sure that there's an agenda, there's meeting notes, and those get circulated after the meeting. And the agenda and the meeting notes are incorporated in the calendar view itself. So you don't have to go hunting for what happened during that meeting. You've got all of it in one spot.
Yeah, we're a big believer in recording all of that and leaving a repository for on-demand communications. There's a common theme here. We've talked so much about equitable access and time zones and cultures around the world. We in America, let's face it, we get really centered in America. And the company that we acquired the other day, many of the employees work out of Israel. And just culturally, Sunday's actually a work day there. And then because of the time zone shift, the meeting with Google Meet was from my hotel here at 11 o'clock Saturday night, where my wife as you know that she's here with me, she was sleeping 3 feet in front of me as I'm doing this meeting, slept through the entire thing, which tells you I wasn't all that exciting as a speaker on this meeting. But that is, we in the US, I'm going to say, need to become much more open to changing our time of day to meet the rest of the world, because usually we're expecting folks to meet things on our timetable.
Awesome. So we're going to get to some audience questions now. Parisa, I'm curious, do you have any examples of how you can more fully connect people who are remote besides the water cooler chats? Those were always such a great time for people to be able to get to know each other and build, build relationships. What do you do today, and how do you encourage that?
First, there's actually parts of my team who have formed a future of work committee. And part of that is actually brainstorming kind of these topics. And so part of it's like, be intentional about it and know that good ideas can kind of come from everywhere. Some of the things that we do, especially for new employees, is to immediately pair them up with some leaders, more tenured folks within Chrome who aren't necessarily in their immediate team, but who they can be connected with in their first couple of weeks so that they have more connections with the existing team. Because I think when you're joining as a new employee to a company, it's scary as it is, right? Because you don't know the norms and like who's who, you got a lot of names and tech to ramp up to. So the more friendly faces and just connections you can have to ask simple questions, the better. We use a bunch of different spaces or chat groups within our team which is good for ad hoc communication. And some of it's, really tactical. Hey, there's this issue that we want to solve right now. So that's a faster way to communicate than maybe email. Some of it's just, I think, fun and a way to share like memes and GIFs. And I'm always nervous to say that word on stage because of pronunciation issues. But using technology to form connections outside of just like the tactical work that you're on. And so we have a tool that we built called Lunch Ninja. And essentially, if someone is like looking to make some friends with other folks, you can use the Lunch Ninja, and it will automatically suggest some folks to have lunch with. And during the pandemic, that was happening completely over video conference. And so, you could grab lunch and eat, or you could just hang out to socially have that connection. So those are a couple of examples, but part of it is also just having a team really trying to get feedback consistently, and they share up with me, and we meet quarterly to kind of see what's working, what do people like, what do they want more of, what isn't working, what are new things that we can try, because I think that connectiveness, I really think of, at least at Google, we're kind of like this big brain, and so how can you build synapses kind of across the team? And our teams organizationally are quite distant, but we find ways to bring our teams together so that they can effectively collaborate and just innovate.
Awesome, love that. Amol, if you could give some advice to an organization who's thinking about embracing Google Workspace and balancing end user acceptance and IT trust, what would be your first couple of recommendations?
From a workspace perspective, I think a lot of people use Gmail at home, so it makes it easy for doing the transition. They love, like personally, for example, I am a huge user of filters and labels, and that seems to organize my day. So I think if people love Gmail and they love Workspace, it is actually a very seamless integration across, and it makes the adoption pretty easy. Yeah, they love Chrome too, and it works best in Chrome.
Sorry, just want to shove that in there delicately. No, it's okay.
I need to work Chrome more in. But I think from a workspace perspective, it becomes a very easy journey. And once they see the live collaboration, where you're able to actually work in a meeting, for example, going back to an earlier point, you're working on the agenda or you're working on the meeting notes together. It's not that someone takes notes and then shares, right? Everyone's collaborating at the same time on the same sentence, fixing my spelling mistakes usually. And that really fosters, again, that feeling of collaboration. That's what I think really helps with workspace adoption and then all the Chrome extensions.
No, I
make
mean,
it easy.
when I joined Google, those collaboration, they didn't exist. And so I joined with the norm of like sending around docs with attachments and like underscore version 12 final, type thing.
Yeah.
And so I sometimes even just forget how things just happen so fast. And video conferencing over the web, like the web could not have upheld that. And so it's pretty cool to reflect.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate all of you coming here today. Let's have one last round of applause for these inspired leaders.
Oh. That was good.
Thank you for joining us today, everybody. Enjoy lunch, and we will see you shortly afterwards.